and welcome to Trusty Chords, the podcast which aims to celebrate music and those that create it. Cast your mind back 20 years and you might be taken right back to a moment in time where one of the most exciting Australian bands out there on the scene was none other than End of Fashion. Formed in Perth by Justin Burford, who was at the time a member of the Sleepy Jackson, End of Fashion found itself slowly finding fame thanks to constant airplay on Triple J. And by the time 2005 rolled around, the group were readying their debut album. I can speak from experience when I tell you that it was pretty hard to ignore the stark black and yellow colour scheme of the band's debut album and singles, and equally hard was it to overlook singles such as Oh Yeah and The Game. ARIA Award winners with loads of potential, End of Fashion unveiled a few new albums over the coming years, but ultimately went a bit silent in the following years. However, there have been a few singles since 2020, and this year, the group will be putting out their self-titled debut on vinyl and hitting the road for a national headline tour. Speaking as someone who actually saw End of Fashion back in 2006 as part of my first real concert experience, I can't tell you how excited this makes folks like myself. As you might be able to gather by this point, I was lucky enough to be joined by the musical mastermind that is End of Fashion's Justin Burford this week. And yes, I certainly did ask if he remembers that 2006 gig. Anyway, have a listen to End of Fashion's back catalogue and their self-titled debut, buy a ticket to their upcoming tour, have a listen to our chat, and I'll see you at the end of the episode for some general housekeeping. Justin Burford, thank you very much for joining this episode of the Trusty Chords podcast.
It is my pleasure to be here, Tyler. Thanks for having me.
So for those who might not recognise your name, could you give me a quick few words on who you are and why we're chatting today?
Oh, heavens. Who am I? Good question.
It's a very philosophical question, isn't it?
I'm Justin Burford. That's my birth name and my birth name. I am a West Australian Generation X Xennial singer, songwriter, performer, actor guy who somehow, against all odds, managed to carve out a decades-long career in the arts.
So I think the best way of describing you is multi-hyphenate, I guess.
Multi-hyphenate, I like that.
So it's one that looks very, very good in the press release, I find. But I guess before we sort of touch on how you've become a multi-hyphenate over the years, what I love to do at the start of these podcasts is go back in time to where a love of music first formed. So do you happen to have a recollection of your earliest memory of when music first resonated with you?
Oh my gosh. You like immediately just evoked a memory. I think one of my earliest memories is of my dad sitting in like a front living room of one of the old houses I used to live in like decades and decades ago, listening to While My Guitar Gently Weeps over and over and over again.
And I mean, I can only imagine that, hearing something like that, which is a very impactful song, like it's the sort of thing that would, I mean, it would speak to you as well, wouldn't it? And just sort of like do you have a memory of that sort of moment sort of saying to you, hey, you know what, this music thing sounded pretty good. Like that's a world I want to be a part of.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if those memories are that like tangible when you're that young.
Of course. Yeah.
But I definitely felt music. I often get asked, I think it's natural to ask, do you come from a musical family? And I always say, no, I not necessarily come from like a musical, creating family, although it turns out my great-grandfather was a drummer, but that's kind of neither here nor there. I never knew him. But I definitely come from a family and a background of deep musical appreciation. So music's always been sort of the backdrop to all of my memories my entire life. And I remember having quite an affinity for like particularly pop music. Back in, kind of growing up as a suburban kid in the 80s, I guess when pop kind of sort of crystallized as a form. So yeah, I was very engaged with pop music.
Because I mean, you obviously mentioned artists like the Beatles and then going into pop music. So are there any specific artists, I mean, apart from the Beatles and While My Guitar Gently Weeps, like any of those specific pop artists that you sort of remember hearing around that that era, or was it all just sort of a case of it's just a bit more of a background of that sort of shiny, poppier sound?
Yeah, I think it was just I just remember kind of evoking or just connecting feelings to music at a really young age. There's I'm trying to remember the name, like I like Chucky's in Love. You
Oh
know that?
yeah, I do know
Like,
that one. Yeah, that's really sort of sparking a thing in my brain right now.
yeah, like deep cut. But I remember something connecting. Like I've got like a memory associated with that from one of my early houses. We moved around a lot when I was a kid, so like different genres of eras of music kind of take me back to different times and places in my life. But I remember like songs like that. Uh, they just I had an affinity, I guess, with music from a very very young age, and I felt like I kind of knew the nuts and bolts of like pop music innately as a kid. Sort of what a verse was. I didn't necessarily know what these things were called, but I just remember being able to like count along or sing along to a song and just kind of like in my gut knew that there was a change upcoming, or I don't know if I'm explaining that.
No, that makes total sense because it becomes an innate sort of thing where if you're listening to music a lot, you start sort of expecting things. You know, you sort of start expecting, oh, there's supposed to be a drum fill here before we go into a chorus or something like that.
Yeah, like I think I knew what a pre-chorus was and why, like, and how, in a nutshell, it's kind of like a good pop structure is all about tension and release.
Mm.
So I'm kind of glad that I was I had this very, very informal education.
Yeah, and actually, having just looked it up, yes, I understand why I remember that song "Chucky's in Love" is because my mother had a copy of that Ricky Lee Jones album. That would be why.
Mhm.
I knew it was something familiar. But look, when it actually comes to playing music, how did love or this sort of innate knowledge of music turn into playing music for you? Like, what was that journey like?
Um, yeah, so I was about, I can't remember how, 13, 14 maybe, when I discovered Nirvana. And that was a pivotal moment, I think, in my musical journey because the way I've kind of always described that is all the musical influences up until that point kind of came from somewhere else. Like my mum and dad's record collection, or my sister's 5 years older than me. So she was like always very cool.
Mm.
So she through her I was introduced to, I guess, like alternative 80s acts like Morrissey and the Smiths, Depeche Mode, Sisters of Mercy, these kinds of Nick Cave even, that was still considered quite alternative. Violent Femmes, when I was growing up in the 80s. And then Nirvana, really hit in 1991, and that was just like, well, okay, boom, here's my thing. It hasn't come from anywhere else. It's like it's mainlined directly to me. Uh, and like millions of kids around the world, I thought I could play guitar. But my first attempts at playing guitar, learning Nirvana songs, were not very encouraging.
That
Um,
doesn't sound like the story of my life as well.
so yeah, it was like 15, 16, I think, when I first like attempted to play the guitar, and lost interest because I was just crap um, pretty quickly. And then once I left school, I joined a band in school as the singer, and I was like, this is much more my jam. Um, and then once I left school, I pursued a different band. It was a cover band as the singer. But then I met Luke Steele around that time. Um, and I really started becoming a lot more interested in writing my own songs. Um, but this band that I was in, um, my influences and the guitarist influences were really different. So I would bring song ideas in, but I found it really, really hard to communicate what I was hearing um, to this guy and to this band. So just out of pure desperation and in an attempt to be able to communicate these ideas, like I'd come in with melodies and he would write chords, you know, for the melodies that I just knew weren't right. So I came in with very, very simple chord arrangements for the melodies and for the song ideas that I had. And so that was attempt number two at playing the guitar. And it was literally just to facilitate my song ideas. And that time it was much more successful and actually stuck.
Right. So I suppose I should also ask the question, those early bands, like even the one where you started to sing it, and then like the cover band, what were their names? Because I always feel like names like that sort of get lost to time, and they deserve to be unearthed.
I can't remember I don't know if we even had a name for the band I was in high school, but my first band outside of high school was called Dr. Gonzo.
Right, right. Okay. And obviously didn't last that long, so
No,
yeah.
no. Yeah, we started out as a cover band, and I kind of through like persistence and annoyance um, turned us into an original band. But that band lasted for about 2 or so years, maybe. And I kept booking gigs that the guitarist kept pulling out of. So we never actually played live.
Gotcha, right.
Yeah.
So it was sort of destined to fail from the start, really, in a sense.
Hmm.
So you obviously mentioned Luke Steele before. So
Hmm.
obviously, if you sort of like start going through I guess the chronology of your credits and everything, I guess it is like around like the Sleepy Jackson and everything is where some people might sort of recognize your name popping up because I think I'm trying to remember the name of the album.
Lovers
That's
was
the
the
one.
first
That's
album.
what I'm thinking of
Hmm.
because yeah, I can find your name in the liner notes there. So I guess what was that experience like for you? Because I guess that was sort of the first real band you were sort of a bit more involved with, right?
Yeah. Um, so yeah, Luke and I like that's a whole other story how Luke and I met, and pretty fortuitous and quite bizarre looking back on it because to be honest, if I hadn't met Luke, I might not have ended up being like in a band myself. Um, but Luke and I were friends for God a good 2 years or more um, before I was in the Sleepies. Um, and I think he had some issues with his bandmates. I think they just like bailed on him. I think mid tour, and he came back and decided to recruit some friends rather than just musos, and asked me if I wanted to join the band, and I was like, dude, as what? He was like, oh, as the guitarist, and like Luke Steele is a very, very good guitarist. Yeah, I can criticize some aspects of Luke, but I can never criticize his guitar playing. He's an absolute gun. He grew up in playing blues, and not, he just knows that instrument really well. And so when he came to me and asked me to join the Sleepy Jackson as, I think he even said the lead guitarist, I was just like, no, no. Um, but I think he just wanted a band of mates, um, and someone he could bounce ideas off, and just people who are a little bit maybe more like-minded, more Luke-minded. Um, but I turned him down like 2 or 3 times over the course of about 6 months because I knew uh, I knew Luke uh, very well, and I knew that there were different aspects of his personality, um, and that if we become bandmates, it might drastically affect our friendship. Um, so I was really nervous about joining the band, but eventually I did, and it did drastically affect our friendship. Um, but it was, I learned a lot. I was actually in Sleepies for God, probably not even 2 years. I don't
Yeah,
think.
right. So then I guess that, from there we do get to End of Fashion, which is a nice little
Mhm.
segue. So like what was it that made you say, hey, you know what? New band, gonna call it End of Fashion, gonna do all this sort of stuff. What was the impetus for the band?
Um, I'd been playing gigs around town solo, to kind of keep myself to keep my songwriting muscle engaged. Um, And I just remember I'd been doing that for maybe a year or so. Actually, I'd been doing that before I joined Sleepies, and I continued doing that whenever I could, like between tours or between recording with Sleepies. Um, and I got asked to do a gig, um, and I don't know why, but I just decided like, if I do this gig, I want to do it with a band. Um, so I was like, I told the booker, whoever, I can't remember who was booking it, but I was like, if you can give me 3 days to put a band together, I'll do the gig. So I turned around and asked the Sleepies crew, Sans Luke, um, if they'd just be my band and like let's just together have a get together, have a couple of jam/rehearsals. Here's my songs. Um, let's play this gig, and that ended up being the first end of fashion gig.
Had you expected at the time it would actually last any longer than just a gig?
I don't know if like when you're you know, so I can't remember if I was like late teens, early 20s, maybe. I don't know if you're thinking that far ahead at that point in your life.
Yeah, of course.
I think I just wanted to play this gig and hear what these songs sounded like with the band. And I guess I just hoped that the gig would go well and that would be that. But it did go pretty well, which is, I think, why we ended up doing another one and another one.
And it's probably also part of the reason why we're talking today, actually, the fact that it kept on going well.
Yeah.
Because I remember hearing, the likes of Rough Diamonds back in like 2004 on Triple J when it was getting a bit of airplay. And then obviously I remember, how popular the debut album was back when it came out. I mean, I've got a copy of it here, still with the old price sticker on there. And I distinctly remember seeing like that whole yellow and black color scheme coming up on my emails with like the weekly charts and all that sort of thing. But so I guess that was sort of the moment where most people sort of started to get to know both End of Fashion and yourself a little bit better. So, what do you sort of remember about that time? Like when you think back to that era, does anything sort of stick out to you the most?
I think I was like more overwhelmed than I was allowing myself to believe.
Mm.
It's a lot to go through. I also, but there's also not a lot of time. And like at the time, like you're sort of talking about coming to discover or learn of the band's existence around the first album, which is obviously fair and very accurate recollection. But my recollection is like we toured our asses off for a good 2.5, 3 years before that album existed.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually it sort of reminded me of something I've heard some people say, where it's like it's an overnight success that took about 3 years to come about.
I've been saying that a lot in these interviews.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of nights before that overnight. Yeah, and that's the way you did at the time. This is pre-social media. So yeah, to develop a fan base and to build a following, you would go and play shows. I remember it got to the point where we were scheduling our tours around where the dole offices were.
Right.
Up and down the eastern states.
That's pretty solid marketing, really, when you think about it. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if we were that clever. It was more just like desperation. But yeah, I mean, that's how we did it back then. I don't know if that still goes on as much. It might do. I feel like most of it gets done on social media now, but it's felt a lot more organic, and it like if you're not a particularly good band when you start that process, you bloody well will be by the end of it. So yeah, we toured and toured and toured and spent some time in the studio. We put out a couple of EPs leading up to the first album. Yeah, things definitely changed. It kind of changed gears after the first album dropped. And I do remember like feeling like there's definitely been like a step up now in terms of the room sizes that we're playing and the festivals that we're getting on, and we just end up getting even busier.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine, because I mean, I just remember how sort of, at least on Triple J, because I mean, that for me was like the real tastemaker for me at that age. Obviously, that's changed a bit these days.
How old are you?
I'm 30. something. What am I, 33? Yeah, I really had to think there for a second. So I was quite young, sort of like when I was discovering the band, but it was a very formative band for me. I mean, I absolutely flogged the debut album and all that sort of stuff.
Wow.
And it was such a, I mean, tracks like Oh Yeah, for example, like that was sort of one of the most played songs on my iPod that year, I think. And I think
Wow.
it was one of the worst audio rips from the CD. I think I hadn't understood high quality and high fidelity at that point.
Mhm.
But I mean, like, to me, it's a brilliant album and a great sort of snapshot of Aussie rock in that time. But how does the album sort of, when you look back on it, how does it hold up in your mind? Do you look at it with, like, with a lot of pride, or do you look back on it thinking, oh, you know what, 20 years hindsight, could have done this better or something like that? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think 20 years hindsight, there are certainly things that it's not necessarily like, oh, I wish this and I wish that, but it's more like I wonder if, or like what if. Um, I think they were like, and it's not even necessarily about the music itself. Like I can kind of live with, the decisions that were made in producing that album. But I'd sort of do look back on things and kind of go, oh, gee, I wish we'd made some decisions, I guess more business or strategic decisions or whatever you want to call it, a little bit more differently. Um, I wish I was actually talking to Kev Mitchell from Jebediah about this not long ago, and I'm not saying anything, like I'm not throwing anybody under the bus or anything like that, but we both agreed it's just like, wow, we both came up in a time where it was it was much safer to be a lot more naive and disconnected from the machine and from the process than I think it is now. I don't think there is much of a machine now. Um, but I think a lot of artists who are fairly young and fairly naive um, sort of trusted the machine around them a lot more than maybe they should have. And that's not even to sort of infer that there was like any sort of like malice or anything like that. Um, uh, or that there was, like malevolent mechanics, conspiracies or anything like that. It was more just like, I just wish that we'd had a little bit more understanding of how things worked, so we could take a little bit more kind of charge of how, of decisions that ultimately impacted us still and continue to impact us, decades on.
Do you feel as though the band would sort of be in a different place these days had you been able to sort of exercise a little bit more, I guess, control, a little bit, have a bit more assertiveness back in those days?
Yeah, not a doubt in my mind.
Easy
Hmm.
question. Yeah, no, I mean that is completely fair because it is a sort of thing where yeah, as you sort of said, like naivety back then was sort of a bit more expected as well, wasn't it? Like these days, it's much more of a sort of thing where it can be preyed on and it can really change. Yeah, it can change. That's a whole conversation for another time, I'm sure.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, it is
And
something.
I think it was actually like almost celebrated. Like I know that, like, and again, Kevin and I were sort of talking about this and having a laugh about it. It was just like it was considered really cool, and if you were like kind of aloof about like, oh, we don't make those decisions.
Yeah, of course.
It's just
That's
like,
actually really sort of like bring back some memories of all those sort of interviews you'd read back in the day, where it's just where you'd hear people sort of saying like, "Oh, well, we don't pay much attention. Our management team deals with all that," and you're just like,
yeah,
"Oh,
yeah.
that's so cool. They don't care. Oh, wow, I could be like that. I don't care," and etc. Um, but I should also say, End of Fashion also actually holds a very special place in my heart because, I grew up north of Adelaide and I only ever really saw local bands. In 2006, you played the lineup of the first real concert I ever saw. It was October 2006 at the Coffs Harbour Showgrounds with a lineup of Red Riders, End of Fashion, and The Living End.
Oh wow.
And first actual concert I'd actually ever been to, and to this day, it's one of those sort of like formative moments for me where it sort of showed me that music was attainable in a sense.
Hmm.
And it sort of, it was the sort of thing where I was like, you know what? I play guitar terribly in my room. I could start a band. And it was a sort of thing where it really sort of, I guess, opened up that opened up a different future for me, I feel. So, I feel like I should say thank you for that because I feel like it's a sort of thing where I wouldn't be doing this podcast today if it wasn't for bands like End of Fashion, which is a bit of a lofty thing to place upon your shoulders, I guess, isn't it?
It's super cool. I mean, like I don't like I have a tough time taking compliments. Like it's to take on something like anything even more than that is just like, whoa,
I can imagine. I mean, it's not usually the sort of thing I'm throwing at my guests or sort of like, hey, buddy, you changed my life. Here's how.
and it's
But
hard to
I
sort of,
understand.
it's hard to consolidate that as well. Like I
Mm.
one of my, I think the most impactful fan engagements that I ever had was a guy. And I wish I remembered where this was, but it was backstage at a gig somewhere. I think it was like we used to play a lot of unis, um, and I ended up talking to this guy who told me that his brother had passed away very recently, and one of his last of an illness. So he knew he was going, and his request for the song that was played at his funeral was one of our songs,
Wow.
a song called "Rough Diamonds," and yeah, that hit me pretty hard then, and still hits me now. That a song that you can write in your bedroom and kick around with your mates in a garage would go on to mean that much, mean
Yeah.
anything to anyone, let alone be someone's send off.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like you definitely strike me as someone who was very humble. So for someone to sort of say, "Hey, this was the like the end note to my brother's life," like that must be really hard to pass just in general because I can only imagine that for yourself, you're just exercising some creativity, not sort of thinking, "How is this going to affect someone's life?" And
Yeah.
that's a very hard thing to take. I would imagine. I haven't had anyone say that to me, so I can't really comment. But and like I guess we shouldn't dwell on the sadness of everything.
Oh no,
But
but it wasn't sad. It was. I mean, it was sad for a moment, and obviously, I was like, "Oh well, I'm terribly sorry to hear about your loss." But it's I've also had people say, "Oh yeah, we had that song at our wedding," or like, "Oh yeah, it's like it's the song that reminds me the most of like my year 12 ball," and it's just like, wow, that's so bizarre, and I can only imagine how like these, and we're a small band. I think that dreamt we were a big band for a minute, um, but I can only imagine how these like big, really big, genre-defining, world-defining, culture-defining artists can feel. There's got to be sort of some level of detachment, I think. Otherwise, you'd go crazy.
oh, there'd have to be because there's no way you could just sort of live your life in that sort of constant with all that constant I guess adoration and all that sort of feedback. It'd be
Hmm.
very hard to live with.
I mean,
Um,
I remember even kind of coming to like approaching the process of writing the second album and feeling just like I had no idea where to even start.
That's actually a very good question because my next question was actually going to be, after the first album, we then sort of do go into the second record, which was Book of Lies, which actually
Mhm.
features it features the exceptional single Fussy, which has been one that I've always put on mixtapes when I've given to people over the years.
Oh wow, cool.
It's always
Thank
a really
you.
good opener. But I guess as you said, you didn't even know sort of where to begin with the second album. So how do you sort of go into something like that? Like, is there a way to go into it, or do you sort of have to just feel around in the dark a bit and just sort of hope for the best?
Yeah, I like um that's one of the things that I was kind of like, oh, 2020 hindsight, like I feel like we toured the first album probably longer than we should have
Hmm.
because by the time we ended it, that cycle, I was I was trashed. I was absolutely exhausted physically, emotionally. Because by that point, it hadn't just been like the album cycle. Like I said, there'd been 2 or 3 years of like constant touring before that. So then it came to like end of like when would the album dropped in 2005, and we toured that like hard for probably close to 2 years. So we're now approaching like end of 2007, and it was just like the record company and management were like, "Okay, cool, you're done now. That's album one. Now go and write a new album."
Hmm.
And I was a mess, and I was in a long term relationship at the time that uh, it was right at that exact moment that my ex decided to end the relationship. I'm like, cool, thanks. So I had to sort of there was a lot on my plate to process, and I remember I'm not even exaggerating, the first maybe 20 or 30 songs that I wrote to, toward what would be the next record, I took to a record company, the band, friends, and they all came back and said the same thing. This is crap. This is
So
crap.
how do
Go
you
back
sort
and
of how do you deal with that sort of like a reaction?
I don't. I thought I was like an absolute phony. Um, and I think what the second record ended up, what I wish we'd done, um, was go back and find a bunch of the demos and the songs that we'd worked on for the first album that never made the cut. Because I listened back to some of those now when we were putting the special edition vinyl together, and I was like, man, why did we leave these songs off the record? Because there wasn't enough room. It was just like, Jesus, there's like a second record here. Um, and yeah, I wish we'd had the nous back then to be like, we've got a second record. Well, we've got 70% of the next record. It's right here. For some reason, nobody thought of that at the time. Um, uh, so I just had to write and write and write. And for me, Book of Lies sounds to me, and I can't maybe shake this bias, a perception of that record. It's just like I sound like I think what I was, which was a songwriter just trying so many different things to see what worked. And by the end of that process, we were like, 2.5 years out from the first album now, we're getting close to 3 years. We're like, we don't really have much time to kind of keep playing and waiting. So it's just like, whatever we've got, that's the record. And so we recorded it and put it out. And it's not necessarily the album that I would have, like the ideal follow-up, but is what it is.
Yeah, it's a moment in time.
Yeah,
In the end, isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah. So a few years after that, we did get Holiday Trip of a Lifetime, and then I guess like from there, like it's sort of hard to sort of I guess work out the trajectory of the band because there was all these sort of like articles of saying like has the band broken up? Are they on hiatus and everything? So I guess how do you sort of define that? I get what would I guess be the last 12 years of the band?
First of all, just to cycle back to Holiday Trip, at the time, that was probably, I think we all felt like, and I felt like in particular, my most like accomplished body of work. I think out of the three albums that have End of Fashion on their cover, that's the album that I'm genuinely artistically the most proud of. I've said in the past, it's like, not sure if it's an End of Fashion album because it's so flippin' different. But I've decided I'm going to own it and say, yes, it is an End of Fashion album. But it was definitely, it's what happened. The irony of it was we ended up making that record independently. And it was interesting that the first album that we made completely independent of a record company was probably the poppiest, most kind of commercial sounding record that we'd made. It was very much a studio album, and I was stoked with it. It's definitely not a rock and roll album, and I don't think we wanted to make a rock and roll album, but artistically it was super satisfying. I love the songs on there. I hope someday somehow that album gets revisited. Maybe if we called it something else, not End of Fashion, it might have a chance to have a different life. And then that we sort of attempted to release that in like just independently, and it didn't go particularly well. I guess we didn't have the same infrastructure that a label provides. I think the landscape had moved on. I feel like there was an unfortunate kind of alignment, say, with like radio, which was still, this is kind of pre-Spotify and pre-Apple, that the brand End of Fashion was directly associated with like rock, which was by 2000 and God, when was that now? 12?
It was
Well,
12, yeah.
yeah, was like rock was dead. So I think that it was kind of a little bit DOA, unfortunately. I think we tried to service some of that stuff to radio, but it was politely passed on. And I think mostly just because it was end of fashion. I think if we'd packaged it and marketed to something else, it might have, some of those songs may have had we might have had a better chance. So then that was kind of it for me. I thought that was just like, okay, cool, we're done. That's fine. I stopped making music. I started, doing other things. Pursued acting, started painting and stuff a bit more, and then a few years went by. It was actually, I think I wrote it down in that in one of my albums that made an impact on me. Was Unknown Mortal Orchestra's Multi-Love. I remember hearing that song come on the radio and just thinking like, oh my God, what is this? This is so cool. And that actually inspired me to start making or writing music again. But it was very, very different from End of Fashion. So there'd been quite a hiatus for me in terms of making music in general. And then when I did start making music again, for me, it was an End of Fashion. But then, as time went on, we ended up doing a tour, I think in 2016, a Fash tour that went pretty well. And so I started just thinking, I don't know, maybe I should start thinking about End of Fashion again. But for me, it always depended on the songs. Like if the music sounds like Fash, then we'll do some End of Fashion stuff. And yeah, but like you said, there's been sort of little moments in between. I think we've released a couple of singles here and there. We actually started working on an album right around the time COVID hit.
Of course.
Yeah.
That's always how it happens, isn't it?
Honestly, I'm so glad because we were chipping away at this record for, the better part of, 3, 4, 5 years. And I got to the beginning of last year and just decided I hated it. So I threw the album out, took a couple of songs that I liked, and around August or September of last year, I had like a bunch of things that I needed to do. And then, I got back to Perth around August, September of last year, and I was like, right, I've got 6 weeks. I'm going to write a new album, and it's going to be like all based on the things that for me are like comfortable and I feel at home listening to, and I just went right back to those, some of the artists and albums that I put down in that thingy.
Which
like
we'll definitely touch on in a minute. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, Fleetwood Macs and just this stuff that felt like home to me, and that were definitely part of the DNA that made up, especially that first album. Pixies, Nirvana, the Beatles. I mean, I can't forget the Beatles. And I stopped fighting it. I was just like, I'm just going to have fun. I'm just going to let all of these things be the influence that they are. And I booked 3 weeks at my friend's studio, and we went in there and made an album in 3 weeks. And I think it might be my favorite now. I think it's pipped Holiday Trip. And it feels like an End of Fashion record. And it feels like the kind of End of Fashion record that maybe I wish I'd made back in, like as a follow-up to the first album. It was very much like a spiritual successor to that first record.
So then how does it feel, I guess, being somewhat progressive and looking forward and by making new music, but then this year you've got to look back to the past again? Like, does that feel like a bit of a, not double-edged sword, but it's sort of like, it feels almost antithetical towards what you want to be doing, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like I went into this year kind of going like, cool, we're going to, let's start putting music out, but new music out. And yeah, we've had to press pause on that for the minute. And I do respect and understand that, there's strategies and things need to be sort of like rolled out and carefully considered. And so we're hoping that some of the attention or whatever, some of the spotlight back on the band with the first album helps us or puts us in a decent position to announce some new music. But I've been literally talking about new music for half a decade. It got to the point where it became a running joke at our live shows. It's like, this is off our new album that will come out sometime.
Pretty much become a case where people are sort of like, oh, good, he's not talking about new music. He's looking at the past for a change.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that actually works as a nice little segue for us to actually have a look in the past and have a look at some of these selections that you've come up with. So, obviously, the name of this podcast is Trusty Chords. So, that's a very tenuous sort of like name where I look at the 1, 3, and 5 structure of a standard chord. So, I talk about one artist that's been
Oh,
impactful. Yeah. It's I always like that little sound of realization. So, it's one artist that's been
yeah.
impactful, 3 albums that have influenced you, and 5 songs you can turn to.
Mhm.
So, thankfully, I have got your answers ahead of time. So, your most influential artist. You've said it's Kurt Cobain. So
Yeah.
obviously, we sort of touched on Nirvana before, but I guess what is it about Kurt Cobain that sort of made you sit up and take notice?
I don't know if you saw the comment I said. I begrudgingly choose Kurt Cobain because I wanted to like choose someone who I felt was I don't know, not quite as obvious.
Hmm. I
Um,
understand that because you always want to go for the deep cuts. You don't want to go for the ones that sort of that feel obvious, do you?
yeah, but then again, like I'm sort of like, fuck it, that's me. That's I think stop trying to be something else. Um, yeah, I guess what I touched on before was true that I'd grown up listening to what I sort of now think of as like other people's music, like they got to own it, and I got to own it to a degree as well. And I'm kind of like, I guess I am discounting a lot of the stuff that was influential on me as a kid, but was like just radio and TV. So I never really kind of got to own those things. Like I knew who Madonna was and I knew who Michael Jackson was and I loved them. Like I was, a fan of pop, but I never felt like again it was necessarily mine. It felt like everybody's. Um and then there was the records that were on high rotation in the Burford household, which were, like Tango in the Night, is the album that I think of when I think of Fleetwood Mac, which is I think different to how history remembers Fleetwood Mac.
Well, it's actually very funny because out of all the Fleetwood Mac albums, that was the only one we had in the household growing up as well. It was Tango in the Night.
Wow, there you
So
go.
I instantly think of that really crappy sort of artwork compared to the likes of Rumors
Oh,
or something.
I love that artwork.
I
I
mean,
used to stare at it for hours. And actually, that artwork, well, I'm using very much as a direct influence for the cover of the next End of Fashion record.
now I'm definitely regretting saying crappy, but I
No, I
think
know
it's
what you mean though. It's pretty kind of like airbrushed and
that's sort of what I'm
tacky.
getting at because it's the
I'd
sort
say
of thing
tacky.
because
Yeah,
like it's not as iconic as the likes of Rumors, for example. Like Rumors is sort of thing where you could see people getting that tattooed. You look at Tango in the
yeah,
Night, it's
yeah.
like, well, I don't particularly see them getting that tattooed.
hmm But man, like the production, like obviously, the songs always define, an album. At least for me.
Hmm.
I've got these two kids in the band now who are like come from a really sort of techie prog background, and I'm kind of not teaching them, but I'm sort of like showing them the value in songs, and because that's my background was pop, and it's all about the songs. So, and that's what's beautiful for me about Tango in the Night is it's like there's still all of these incredible songs. There's a couple of clangers, but listening back to it again, I was like, holy shit, the production and the arrangements and just the musicality, how everything just plays off. It's like, gosh, that was so damn good.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, that's definitely like a time and place record for me. But I'm trying to remember the point, and I remembered it. But that was my mum's, you know what I mean? And like Dire Straits, that was my mum's. And then as we got a little bit older, and my sister was, in high school, and like she was a bit of a cool kid, so she was sort of privy to, and me by extension, um, I guess like the precursor to what ended up becoming alternative music. It's like 80s alternative music, which was like your Violent Femmes, um, Smiths, Morrissey, Sisters of Mercy, Depeche Mode, Nick Cave, Um, and so I then, through my sister, was introduced to all of this like super cool music. Um, and then the early 90s came along, and like I still vividly remember seeing the video for Smells Like Teen Spirit for the first time and just going like, well, that's it.
Mm.
That's like everything's changed now. I felt immediately changed, and I felt like immediately that like this is mine. This is my generation's thing.
Yeah. And I guess it's one of those things where the rest is history,
Yep,
isn't it? Yeah.
yep, yeah. And
And
I think that was my sort of like gateway drug into thinking like, because maybe all of these other bands, like you've got these high production values of something like Tango in the Night that that felt completely unattainable. And I think what made Nirvana so special was like, even though Nevermind is a highly produced record, when you boil it all down, these were songs that you could pick a guitar up and just immediately play.
absolutely. And I guess sort of on that sort of link before, you sort of mentioned like, pop music and everything. When we come to the albums front as well, we kick off with a brilliant album, which is George Michael's Faith.
Hmm.
So, I mean, George Michael he is well, was sadly, brilliant musician. And I guess Faith is one of those things where it's just, that's an old timer of a record, isn't it?
Oh my gosh, he's criminally underrated, I
Mm.
think. I'm sure he'll like. Well, I hope that he gets his time in the sun again, like with the things like TikTok and stuff that seems like randomly picks out
Yeah.
a song that suddenly becomes viral. Like I know Dreams did a couple of years ago, and what was it, Horses? Daryl Braithwaite, I think,
Oh, yeah.
got put on like some major, like headlining some major festival because Horses had gone
Yeah.
viral.
That's
That's
crazy, isn't it?
insane. But I love it. I love that about the modern landscape. But I'm hoping George Michael gets his time as well, because I think people remember him as being a great singer, which he was. Um, I don't think he gets his due as a songwriter because he was like a pop star in the 80s, as opposed to your Michael Jacksons and your Madonnas and stuff. Like he was writing his own stuff, and this is pretty sophisticated music. Um, and as underrated as he is as a songwriter, I think he's even more underrated as a producer. You actually look at the liner notes of Faith, he produced that album.
I mean, it's a brilliant. I mean, it's one of the very few records I've actually got. Got the whole book on Faith here because it's such a great album, and I
Yep.
love sort of going deep on all of that there. But then I guess on the like opposite side of things, like this next one we've got here, it's the soundtrack to The Crow. So
Mhm.
brilliant movie, brilliant soundtrack, and I think it's actually the first time I've had a guest actually pick a soundtrack as well. And I mean, I was revisiting the soundtrack ahead of this chat, and it's such a walk down musical memory lane for myself. There's so many great artists, but what was it about this one that really resonated with yourself?
I literally just got goosebumps. That's what that album does to me. I 100% think of it as an album. There was a beautiful moment in the sort of early to mid 90s where soundtracks started to become their own um, art form. Um, I think there was like, for me, the Crow soundtrack is the best soundtrack of all time. I know that there's other opinions on that. Um, and then there's like, I think the soundtrack to Natural Born Killers is just like, it's a piece of
Oh
art
yeah,
that you can put on and listen to from start to finish, and it's almost like it reminds me of something like a War of the Worlds, how that would have made people feel, 20 years earlier. But uh, I never got to see The Crow at the movies, unfortunately. A pretty conservative family that didn't let me go and see films unless I was fit into um, the age restriction. So I had to wait for it to come out on video, and yeah, immediately changed my life. Like I think I'm a bloody romantic at heart, because some of my favorite films are just when you cut away um, trim the fat, the core of it are romance films, and The Crow is absolutely very, very stylized romance.
mm,
Um, but like, man, that soundtrack is just like, it's just cracker after cracker, and it introduced me to a lot of artists that I wouldn't necessarily have gotten into had it not been for that.
I mean, I'm just looking over the track list now, and actually, like, funny enough, actually, one of the musicians on there I've actually had on this podcast before. I've had the Jesus and Mary chain on here.
Oh
I
wow, that's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, I should say the Jesus and Mary chain. Plus, you also mentioned Kev Mitchell earlier. I've had him on here as
Hmm.
well, but sadly, he's not on the Crow soundtrack. But it's such a brilliant one. I mean, it's something I definitely recommend to anyone who is actually listening to this podcast who wants a bit of a a snapshot of what was it 1994? Yeah, 1994.
Yeah,
It's such a brilliant time for music, and so many great bands of that era on there. I recently went on a big Nine Inch Nails kick actually, so I was listening through some of the all their stuff and all of their deep cuts. So the Crow soundtrack definitely came up recently.
yeah,
But I guess as a bit of a tonal shift, the last one you've got is an album you mentioned previously, which was Multi Love, the Unknown Mortal Orchestra. So I guess this one, in the context of what you said before, it sort of helped, reinvigorate your love of music a little bit, didn't it?
yeah. It felt like pure freedom hearing that, and I don't know if you're aware of. Well, I think they're a band now, but what's his name? Ruben
Ruben
Nielsen.
Nielsen, yeah.
Yeah. Um, he started out as just like just a little project, a recording project. And the first couple of records are like they're cool. There's some really good moments on there, but I think Multi Love is just like we're probably going to remember it as the pinnacle Unknown Mortal Orchestra record. I do like the stuff that he's done after that, but I felt like there was still that scrappiness of the early UMO on Multi Love that's now kind of been maybe just some of those edges have been polished off a little bit too finely.
Yeah.
Um, but there was this. I was just like, I don't think I could articulate it when I first discovered that record, but I think I have found a way in the phrase like you can do that, and it's like this blending of like obviously like a lot of old school sort of like Motown R&B. Obviously this guy's like really informed by that, but then there's just so much rock, like old like classic kind of rock and roll tropes in there. Like he's an absolute gun of a guitarist as well. And then there's like some really bizarre like chord changes and chord structures and that aren't even like that aren't jarring. I think when you're listening to it, but when you sit down and kind of try to um, you know break it down, you're like shit. There's a lot going on in these songs than what first meets the ear. Yeah, that was the album that made me want to start making music again. So that's why I had to put it like it's a newer album, even though it's like what 15 years old now.
2015 it came out, so only 10 actually.
Okay, 10 years old.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but yeah, that was I have to thank. I hope I get to meet him one day because I'd like to thank him.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's also so wild to actually think that, you look at his previous work with the Mint Chicks and then you look at how it sort of goes on to Unknown Model Orchestra and you're sort of like
Mhm.
it's chalk and cheese a little bit, but you can see the links. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
I was lucky enough to see UMO back in 2014 before Multi Life came out. And after the album came out, I was like, oh, I should have paid more attention. If this
yeah.
is what they're putting out, I wish I sort of paid a lot more attention. But I guess also in the interest of time, because I don't want to keep you forever here. We could chat about music forever, I'm sure. But I'd love to know these 5 songs of yours. So the first one we've got here is we've mentioned the band and we've mentioned the song actually already. It's Dreams with Fleetwood Mac.
Hmm.
So it's a hell of a song, and the fact that the younger generations are discovering it is, I guess it's a damn good thing because it's a song that deserves to be heard by everyone, isn't it?
Yep. Yep. Well, I took your the way you'd phrase the question, like the 5 songs that you can always turn to.
Mhm.
I was like, okay, well, what does that mean? And for me, Dreams is it's an old friend, and it's this pillowy cloud um, that I think is timeless. Even though I've cited Tango in the Night as my favorite Fleetwood Mac record, there's not a doubt in my mind that Dreams is my favorite Fleetwood Mac song. And I guess like when you go from, I have such an appreciation for more complex, like deliberately, technical songwriting. things like Paul Simon and stuff like that, where it's kind of quite jazzy, and Ruben Nielsen with his, sort of tendency to be a little bit jarring in his chord choices. Dreams is two chords, and
Yeah, true.
it's perfect.
There's beauty in simplicity, isn't there?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I also really appreciate when someone actually responds to the question of the songs you can turn to with some sincerity, as opposed to just being like, "Oh, what's on my shuffle right now?" It makes for much better answers. And our next one here, it's one of my favorites, "Debaser" by Pixies.
Hmm.
I mean, you mentioned Nirvana before, and I mean the fact that Nirvana was sort of trying to imitate the Pixies a little bit when it came to Nevermind. I mean that speaks volumes, doesn't it?
Yeah, I want to say, because like I do a Nirvana show, and it's become a bit of a running joke, that you've always got these gatekeepers. I mean, Nirvana is one of the most gate kept bands of all time,
Yeah.
and people are like, oh, Kurt would hate this. He hated like covers and stuff like that. It's just like, this is a dude that literally said if he was going to start a band and didn't start Nirvana, he would have started a Pixies cover band.
And that's exactly why my own band usually ends our sets with a Nirvana cover as well, just because of the fact that we just think, you know what, screw it, screw the gatekeeping, embrace
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, no. Kurt would love the fact that he's being remembered and celebrated by other musicians. Anyway, we digress. Um, I took for this one the turn to, as less of like a comfort thing like Dreams is, and more of a I think the Pixies in general, but very much with this song, the way it's produced, the way that it's been written, I come back to every now and then as like a touchstone of like sometimes you can just do whatever you want. It doesn't have to be perfectly refined. It doesn't have to even have the semblance of a pop structure. Um, Sometimes it can just be ridiculous and yeah, almost a little bit silly.
But it's brilliant though, and that bass line that it kicks off with, it's just that's the sort of thing that it transports me to another world when you hear that in that
Hmm.
way. And I guess speaking
It
of
keeps me grounded, I think, is what I'm trying to say. The Pixies keeps
yeah.
me grounded. If I start kind of going too far up my own ass, I can always go back and listen to, especially Doolittle,
Mm.
and just be like, "Oh, dude, just throw it away."
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess on the, you mentioned throwing it away, but then on the other side of things, you have a band that really brings everything together, which was the Beatles, especially with Sergeant Pepper's. And we've got the
Hmm.
closing track, A Day in the Life. So I should ask, when you listen to this one, do you listen to it all the way through to get to the, the high pitched dog whistle and the backwards stuff at the end?
Yeah, you haven't listened to
Exactly.
A Day in the Life unless you've listened to the
Exactly
entire
right.
thing.
It's all or nothing, isn't it?
It was between that and Bohemian Rhapsody, and for me, they take up the same space.
Hmm.
But I was like, I didn't have a Beatles reference yet in there, and I had to kind of pick and choose between Queen and the Beatles because they were both super important to me as a kid. But I think Beatles trumps slightly, and A Day in the Life slightly for me trumps Bohemian Rhapsody in that sort of three-act structure, sort of operatic, um, you know, piece of music that takes you on a journey.
Hmm.
Because they did it first, and I don't think anything quite sounds as good as A Day in the Life. It's just mental that these guys were like they weren't even 30 yet, and they were doing things like this.
Yeah, that's one of those things where I like if I ever feel inferior, I just think about what the Beatles. Well, I don't know. If I ever feel inferior, I think about the fact that by this point in my life, the Beatles were well past the Beatles. They were under solo careers,
Hmm.
and that's a little bit depressing. And I guess speaking of slightly depressing, but in an uplifting way, our second to last song is "Teardrop" by Massive Attack. Now,
Yep.
brilliant song, very gorgeous song, especially with the vocals of Elizabeth Fraser in there as well. So, what is it about this song that speaks to you?
I have to be honest. I was thinking like, shit, what am I gonna like? There's just to try to nail it down to 5 songs is
Mm.
almost impossible. Um, so I took a break from thinking. I got up to make myself a coffee, and I was walking down the stairs to my kitchen. I started humming love is a verb out of nowhere and thought, bloody hell, that song, it chose me, I think, rather than the other way around. And yeah, I think I think I also maybe deliberately chose it because I didn't want everything to be like white boy rock and roll.
Mm.
Because I am definitely more than that. I mean, like I love Prince, I love Stevie Wonder, I like this. Ella Fitzgerald and, Nina Simone. All of these people have had a massive impact. But I also like the fact that there's still something, even though that's kind of a very studio sort of and produced track, it still has like that. There's still something like really organic going on in that record and in the way that song is produced. That was a bit of a gateway for me discovering some like other artists around that time, like Tricky, and I think it kind of might have, in a sort of protracted long way around, might have opened me up to a lot more hip hop and stuff as well. Ultimately, it's a really important song, and it's beautiful. And yeah, in terms of it sort of fitting on the list, I would kind of put that close to the Dreams thing, where it's just like it's very, very comforting.
And I understand where you're coming from as well, especially with like opening you up to hip hop and to trip hop as well. But I also feel like it's a sort of thing where it shows you that there's beauty in these sort of genres you wouldn't think there is beauty in. You wouldn't think that there's beauty in hip hop, but then that sort of leads you to trip hop, and you're like, oh, actually, it's a little slippery slope, and it all connects.
Now that I think about it, I could have easily have put like any number of like Wandering Star, maybe Portishead, in place of Teardrop, but that whole album, Dummy, was kind of around the same time period in my musical education.
Of course, yeah. And for our final song, we've got brilliant Leslie Gore with Cry Me a River. So why is this a song that you always turn to as part of your trusty chords? Have to do a bit of a title drop there.
It's perfect. So I discovered this whole album close to 10 years ago, maybe 2016, 2017, somewhere around there. I can't remember how I stumbled across it. I think she's most known for that It's My Party and I'll Cry If I Want to. It must have just come up on like some weird Spotify algorithm playlist thing. The first thing that struck me was the production. I was just like, this sounds modern. When was this? I know that this is an old song, but this could have been recorded like this year. Everything was so clear and big, but still quite minimal. And so it put me on this bloody Leslie Gore rabbit hole for like months. And I had to learn all of the songs and play them on the guitar, and but this was the song that I kept coming back to. So again, it was one of those songs that sort of found me rather than me finding it. I think it's just one of those. It's on constant sort of background rotation in my head. I think she's incredibly underrated, and she should be remembered by a modern audience.
Definitely one of the artists who I think a lot of people look at as a bit of a one-hit wonder. You've got the likes of It's My Party, but there's so much more brilliant stuff hiding under the surface.
Maybe that's what I can relate to.
There we go. You are much more than just the sum of your successes. There is so much more under the surface, and people need to be diving deep into it, don't they?
I'm the modern Leslie Gore.
That's the tagline right there. Well, Justin Burford, I want to say thank you so very much for your time today and for being part of the Trusty Chords podcast.
Thanks for having me, Tyler. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Trusty Chords. If you listened to this episode and enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it if you were able to take a few moments to like, follow, share, and review this podcast on your preferred platform of choice. As always, no obligation, but I'm forever grateful if you do. As always, I'm over on Instagram and Facebook at Trusty Chords Podcast, all one word. I've also got the blog on my website, which is tylerjenke.com. That's TYLERJENKE/Trusty Chords Podcast, all one word. That's where you can find a list of all the songs chosen by my guests each week, along with a playlist of all the songs chosen thus far. You can also find a link to the Buy Me a Coffee platform, where you can throw me a few dollars to keep this podcast running, if you feel so inclined. I also need to thank Justin Burford for spending his time with me this week for the podcast, and I also need to thank Caitlin from Crowd Favorite for helping to organise the chat as well. But once again, thank you kindly for listening, and I hope to see you all again next week as I continue to celebrate music and those that create it.